In this video, I'm going to cover exactly what it takes to grow a SaaS to a multi-million-dollar run rate, and I'm going to use real-life examples of other SaaS companies, how they've done it themselves, and exactly what they change at each stage of the journey, and what they had to do differently to actually attain the next level of revenue growth. I'm also going to use my own personal life experience of working with SaaS companies for the last 5 years, where I've worked with dozens of SaaS companies, helped them generate millions of worth of pipeline. So in this video, we're going to cover exactly what worked, what didn't work, and what they have to do differently at each different stage of the journey to actually attain the next level of growth. Okay, so let's dive in. So the very first stage which we're going to talk about is going to be the stage from 0 to a million ARR. Okay, so this is a crucial stage which every startup goes through, and it's not an easy one. And just heads up, if you've already covered this stage and it's not the one which interests you the most, feel free to skip across to the next chapters of the video, which we're going to cover 1 to 10 million ARR, 10 to 30 million ARR, and 30 million to 100, and so on, which might be more relevant to you. So feel free to skip ahead. If not, feel free to stick around. So, depending on where you're at in your journey of building a startup, you might have already validated the demand for your product. You might not, okay? So just for those that haven't yet validated the demand, I would basically think about the following rule of thought. One was actually applied by Buffett, which is today a 20 million ARR company. They actually didn't write a single line of code before they actually created the product, okay? And this is the idea of they actually built a landing page and got signups, and they tried to basically understand is the problem we're trying to solve actually worth solving? Okay, so I think this is a problem which a lot of startups get themselves into, is that they're yeah, my idea is great and we're going to do this, we're going to do this, but does the market actually need that? That's the real question. And because the market will be very brutal in terms of feedback. If the market doesn't give you any money back in terms of them handing back money to you, customers actually paying for your solution, that means the problem you're trying to solve and what you think is so valuable isn't that valuable. And it's a real shame, but a lot of startups actually fall inside this bucket. So I think that trying to get real data back from the market and talking to real customers, which will be real users, is the most valuable thing you can do, especially in these early stages. And we'll talk about a few of these extra points here, which are going to be so crucial in terms of growing in these small stages. Okay, so what I would do is I would get a very simple landing page. I would have a structure in terms of showing the main features of the product. Let's say 1 to 2 to 3 features of what is the main stuff we're trying to solve, who is this for the solution for, how do we solve it, and why is it important, basically. Okay, and in that landing page, I'll try and get people to sign up, and even better, try to get them onto discovery calls. That way I can get real user feedback on the calls and understand even better maybe the problem which I'm trying to solve, and maybe there's an even better way of solving it, and that way I can get more feedback basically from those calls. Okay, so that's the initial idea there. And then the next idea is that you're going to have to stay very lean and very flexible in these early stages and basically iterate on your product very rapidly, okay? That doesn't mean shipping a lot of features in every single direction, because that's a trap which also a lot of companies fall into, is wanting to ship basically features in every single direction possible. But the thing is, that is not going to solve basically your core product at the core, basically, okay? So you want to stay in the mindset of okay, we're going to stay very flexible, but still that means still having a focus in terms of what exactly are we trying to solve and what we're going to give to our customers. Okay, so I think a great example of this was, for example, Submagic. In the early stages, the founder spent the first year and a half spending about 4 hours just on customer support and trying to understand very well what problem they were solving for their customers and what did the customers actually need from them in terms of feature sets, in terms of what they could do better for their customers. And for example, David, the founder of Submagic, he realized that actually the main thing they were solving in the marketplace, their go-to-market strategy in terms of penetration, was the only single feature around captions. They just need to solve captions better for people who want to do short form content. Okay, they were doing the caption side. There was so many angles, so many feature sets they could have done, but the main thing which people cared about was doing captions on short form videos so they could speed up their content creation process. And David simply doubled down on that basically, but that's because he had such a very close relationship with what the market actually needed and what their customers were coming to Submagic for in the first place. Okay, so this is going to be one of the key ways which you're actually going to have a competitive edge, is it how well you're going to be close to your customers and actually listen to their needs. Okay, so that's that idea here. The next idea as well is going to be the concept of you basically need to be doing the unscalable things, okay? And this actually is an advice which is given to a lot of companies who go to Y Combinator, and which Paul Graham gives, is do the unscalable, okay? Because, and the example he uses is, for example, Stripe. In the early days, Stripe, the founders were still integrating the APIs for their customers, and they were still doing, like, you could say it's a very unscalable thing. A lot of companies often, first of all, want to straight away jump into the most scalable process, scalable marketing channel they could ever do. And it's actually distracting from the main core goal. Is like, how well are you solving the problem you're aiming to actually solve? And basically by doing the unscalable, you can really go above and beyond and create that differentiating factor in terms of like how your brand serves your customers, basically. So, that example there from Stripe, who's now $1 billion company, just so clear in terms of like in these early stages, you really want to be doing the stuff which is unscalable and just going above and beyond, trying to really understand the problem you're trying to solve. So that's this first idea here of like doing the unscalable. And then the next thing as well, it's going to be like, in terms of acquisition, you need to basically be testing which is the acquisition channel, which is going to get you from 0 to 1 million ARR. And of course, you need to have your numbers in mind in terms of like what unit economics, etc. But like, first of all, you want to be thinking about the channels in a way that like makes sense depending on like your setup, if you're funded, if you're bootstrapped. But like naturally, what I would personally lean towards is like founder-led marketing, because founder-led marketing compared to other channels, they have basically such there's a much bigger relatability and shareability aspect in terms of like creating a lot of trust for a singular person. And basically that part of like sharing along the journey, sharing along the mission in terms of like what you're trying to solve will be much more relatable and have a lot better resonance, let's say, with the market, like when it comes through a person, when it comes to, compared to it coming from a company, basically. Okay, so I think that'd be a very underrated way of just getting started basically in the market. And if you see like a lot of companies, even for example, let's say RB2B with like Adam Robinson, like founder-led marketing was a key way they managed to get themselves into the market and really just create that penetration like quickly. So I would start with that. That also builds content, education, that breaks down the trust barriers a lot of customers have before they actually want to get involved with a company and a product. So I would use that for like content creation and inbound. And then what I would say to myself is like, how can I find another channel to bolt on which my CAC can stay relatively stable? So personally, I would stay away from other channels like paid, etc. Of course, it depends on your funding, but like I still think that like depending on how it all really depends on your funding and basically how you set up. If you're bootstrapped, I would stay very lean. If you're funded, of course, you can start venturing into paid. If you have lots of runway, you can start going into SEO, etc. But it all really depends in terms of how your setup is. But personally, what I would do is I think to myself, okay, like let's stay lean, and I would try and like double down maybe on like cold outbound, because once I actually have my infrastructure set up on the back end, once I have my campaigns, my angles, I've narrowed down my ICP, I know exactly what the triggers, I can basically have a CAC which is relatively stable in terms of basically just scaling up or down my infrastructure as needed, basically to scale up my volume and how many leads I can actually reach out to. Okay, but still, that allows to have a CAC which is relatively stable and have inputs which basically make sense in terms of scale in these very early stages. Okay, that's what I'd be thinking about. So for example, Loom, they doubled down on the virality side of their products when they realized that was one of the key ways they were going to grow. They didn't get distracted with too many acquisition channels. They say to themselves, okay, we know the virality side of our product is going to be a key way we're actually going to grow. How can we double down on this? How can we get more users to actually share and sign up, basically? So trying to incentivize team usage, for example, in the very onboarding stage, and just trying to like incentivize basically the virality side of sharing Loom videos, etc. Okay, so they double down on that side. So I think that's like a key trait. But like in this stage here, you basically want to come out of it with this core principle of like you want to have one ICP. Okay, so one very clear person you're trying to actually serve. You've got one burning hair problem. Okay, it's not a nice to have, it's a burning hair problem. Okay, so burning problem. And then you want to also have one acquisition channel, which is basically going to allow you to scale. Okay, and you like 1 to 2, but the idea being is that you don't want to get distracted in these early stages. The next thing we could also say would be around team size. So for example, ConvertKit, you got Nathan Barry, they scaled to over 7 or 8 figures ARR with a small team, which is like a few remote team members. And that just shows like in these early stages, you really want to stay lean. Cash is obviously oxygen for a business, so the better use of resources you have is obviously going to be much better in terms of like funding that growth. But like you just want to stay lean and you want to think about things cleverly. But then after, the next thing is like, depending on how much, once you got traction, you got a bit of cash coming in terms of how you want to allocate those resources. Obviously, I would try and outsource as a founder stuff which, you know, takes a lot of time, which maybe isn't the best use of your time as a founder. So that might be like, for example, customer support and admin. That's not saying staying away from the customers in terms of what they need. That just means in terms of like maybe doing, you know, the small fixes which are needed to run a SaaS. But like, the idea being is like trying to get more leverage back on the time you have, and then especially thinking about maybe bringing in some contractors or some people who have already been there, done that, in terms of like starting up a new acquisition channel, if they're bringing in an agency, etc., because they're going to allow you basically to get to your goals much faster because they already have the experience, they already have the processes, they already have the team in-house, and they can just get you basically to your goals much faster, okay? Because at the end of the day, there's a concept I like, which is the concept of ignorance tax. It comes from Alex Mosey. It's like either you're going to pay for what you need right now in time and energy in terms of like you having to go through the lessons, go through the failures, and just go through the pain basically of learning how to do something. If not, you can pay basically with money someone else who's already got that experience, who's been there, who's done all the lessons already, and you can basically take all that and you can speed up basically your acquisition and to get your goal basically quicker. And I prefer the latter because naturally it just gets there a lot faster and that money comes back basically a lot quicker. So that's this stage here from 0 to 1 minute ARR. It's pretty brutal in terms of like all the stuff you have to go through, but like those are a few key lessons from a few other companies which like been through those stages and a few ones you can take away yourself from. So let's dive into the next one. The next one is going to be from 1 million to 10 million ARR. Okay, so let's dive into this one. Okay, so this second stage here is going to be the part from 1 million to 10 million ARR, okay? So this is going to be a lot of amplification and scaling of what is basically already working. And also just trying to basically grow faster here, okay? So just one last note on this first stage here from 0 to 1 million ARR. This is going to be a stage which we said is going to be trying to find product market fit, okay? And just one last comment on that idea of product market fit. I really like the analogy which Guillaume Robert uses to say like, when you have product market fit, it's like, everything just works. It just clicks basically, and everything becomes much easier, and it's very clear like you're in this stage of product market fit and that has been achieved, okay? And he also says like if you're asking yourself the question, it's probably because you don't have it, okay? So that is what you're trying to achieve in that first stage, and now inside this second stage you're trying to scale out basically what is already working here, okay? So this stage here is going to be a question of, first of all, maxing out the acquisition channels which you're already running and running them even better. I really like the framework which Alex Mosey uses, which is basically the concept of, first of all, we do more, then we do better, and then we do new, okay? And this comes down to the idea that actually a lot of times before you actually need to move on from one acquisition channel to another, a lot of the times you can do more of it, then you can do once you can't do any more, in that case, you're going to come back to your email copy, for example. Let's say you're sending so many emails. You're going to come back to the better copy, better email angles, better intent triggers, etc. Then after, you're going to do more again. And when these two, you can't do any more of it, in that case, you're going to start opening up a new channel. But the idea being is like you need to have focus in terms of both like on the product side, but also on the marketing, especially in terms of where you're spreading your energy and where you're putting your attention, because you can actually scale very well once you've got a proven channel, and you should probably max it out, okay? But this is often a time also during this stage here, you're going to start to bolt on new acquisition channels, okay? Because also you have more capacity in terms of resources, and you can start thinking about stuff more holistically as well. Because if you think about the customer journey, the touch points are multiple, and sure, it's definitely very good advice to just scale one acquisition channel as best as possible. But still, at the same time, you can basically have a lot of different touch points across the customer journey inside different parts of the funnel. And you want to think to yourself, okay, how can we maximize this? Okay, so usually this is a phase here where you start bolting on like new acquisition channels. So for example, let's say in the early stages, you were running founder-led marketing, you had maybe outbound running as well, maybe you had paid ads. Well, maybe now you start to bolt on organic channels, right? Like SEO would be a really important one, YouTube SEO would be also a very important one too. Actually, if you're interested on search everywhere optimization, that's like the new trend where SEO is actually heading. I've actually released a guide on all the parts you need to know about search everywhere optimization, so feel free to check that one out. The link is inside the comments. But like that would be like a new channel, which is like content marketing, and that basically applies here to this part of like this growth stage where you're starting to bolt on new acquisition channels, which make a lot of sense depending on like how much resource and time you actually have available, okay? So this is going to be the idea here. The next thing which is definitely going to creep up is going to be churn, okay? So churn, especially this stage, is going to be a very big problem. Over at Mailshake, for example, they experienced churn at this stage here, and they had to solve it themselves by understanding, first of all, like what are the drop-off points of activation. They realized that was during the onboarding that people didn't understand very well how they could get success, basically. So Mailshake had to put a lot of efforts in terms of making sure that the onboarding experience for customers was very clear, how they could basically get success and how they could get time to value, okay? So you're going to have to basically identify what are the drop-off points in terms of activation, and how can we make our product simply like more successful for our users, they can get success, they can keep using our product, and how can we increase their retention? Of course, depending on your product category, like certain products can be more sticky than others by nature. So for example, if you're in accounting software, that's a very sticky software by default, and other product categories are going to be less sticky, which means you have to put more effort into the whole education and the onboarding process and just making sure your users activate properly. So that is going to be a big problem here, and which you're probably going to have to solve at a certain point during this stage, basically retention. The next point we could talk about would be talent, in terms of like how that shift is going to happen. So often, for example, during this stage here, like you've got a few key people. There's a lot of execution heavy because you're trying to just try and get stuff done, etc. Maybe you've also focused on having quite a few external contracts, etc. So what you're going to start doing here is during this stage is trying to basically hire people which are going to take more ownership of a channel or ownership of a specific responsibility. And that way what they can do on their end is they can hire people under themselves basically, and then bring in other people to basically help out with those different functions. And for example, that can either be internal people to help out with internal resources under their same responsibility, or that would also be hiring, for example, agencies, okay? Because it still makes a lot of sense here. But once again, when you're trying to plan out a new acquisition channel, once again, you want to shorten your time to learning by basically hiring someone who's already been there, done that. And it still makes a lot of sense here to hire agencies also to basically benefit from their experience, their processes, and bring that all in-house and scale faster. Okay, so that's going to be a lot of those activities there which are going to be run. But overall, you're in a growth mindset in terms of like, okay, we have something that works, we want to basically scale this out, we need the right people here which are going to come on board, and we basically want to get there faster by bolting on new acquisition channels. And the product side, you're going to be defining out much better like exactly what you guys are still doing in the marketplace. You can start bolting on new features and basically answering the needs of your customers better. That's also going to go also for a phase maybe on the sales side, you're going to add like a few sales reps, but mainly it's still going to stay relatively lean. Probably not going to be the stage where here you're going to bolt on that many compared to the next stage of growth. But like this is like roughly what you're going to be doing around this stage here, like 1 to 10 minute ARR. And you can definitely basically, if you're inside the product category, of course, which allows that, like with these focuses here already, that can allow for that stage of growth by still keeping basically a very narrow focus. Okay, so let's dive into the next stage of growth. That's going to be from 10 to 30 and like what comes up. Okay, so this stage of growth here. So this third stage here is going to be the stage from 10 mil to 30 mil. So quite a few things are going to change here in terms of approach, in terms of what you're going to have to be focusing on. So in terms of acquisition, there's still going to be an idea of channel diversification in terms of like here, you have a lot more capacity, both in terms of resources financially to deploy and also in terms of team set, which means you've got mental bandwidth to basically focus on more acquisition channels and start to really broaden out basically the brand, in terms of like how many surface areas you guys are actually mentioned on and how much attention you basically own inside the marketplace. Okay, so definitely this idea here of channel acquisition in terms of diversification, that is like a key part. The next part often, which you often see companies here, is a move up market as well. That's like a bigger shift, which is internally in terms of like the product and the positioning you guys have in the market, is trying to go after deals with bigger ACVs. And this is often like this type of stage around here where we see companies trying to move up market, and to do so, they're having to maybe like restructure things internally. Maybe that's a question of like adding customer support teams in specific countries. Maybe that's adding specific security issues. Maybe that's opening up specific features. But the goal basically is like to be able to land bigger customers. Maybe it's more enterprise customers, or just move simply up higher up market where the ACVs are better. There's certain things that you have to do basically to fill in the requirements of those customers, and that is going to ask quite a few different shifts internally in terms of how the product is actually positioned and how the company is structured. Okay, so that is going to be a clear pattern often of companies during this stage to 30 minute ARR. So for example, Lemlist, for example, they had a very clear goal basically when they were during this stage to keep moving towards bigger teams with bigger sales teams, because naturally, just by nature of who those customers were, the churn obviously was much lower and the ACV was higher, which means as a whole, it just made sense basically to double down basically that subset of customers. And this is why, like, when you're growing a company, what gets you here won't get you there is just like a pattern basically. Every single stage of a company is different, both on like the acquisition, on what you're focusing on, both on what the founder is spending his time on, but both also in terms of like what is needed from the company in terms of like what we're giving our customers. That is always changing in every single new basically growth milestone, the needs are completely different. That's why we say like what got you here won't get you there, because every single time it's going to change. Okay, so for example, one big thing here which is also going to change is like you're going to basically accumulate, often a lot of companies accumulate a lot of like talent debt, which would be one, because like talent debt, process debt, and just technical debt. Okay, so just dive into each one. But like for the talent debt, the idea being is like when you're a small company, you don't have much value proposition. Usually, depending of course if you're funded, if you bootstrap, but like if you bootstrap, you don't have the capacity to go and pay someone as much as the company on the side, which is funded, who's got millions of funding, who can afford the 250k CMO with the great experience, etc. Like you don't have those resources, which means you're having to hire people who maybe are up and coming, who are early on in their career, who are, you know, maybe you're hiring for a culture fit. You're hiring not for people who have lots of experience already and already been there, but like people are really willing to learn and like really got the hustle in them. So this is going to be like during this stage here, you've maybe accumulated different people maybe on the team who maybe they might still be relevant to actually be there, but some of them might not actually be relevant to be there because you have this talent debt. And it also means that like now you have the resources also to hire people who have been at companies that have grown from this stage to this stage, and they already know like exactly what is needed to go from this stage to this stage, which means you can basically hire those people, get their experience on board, and those are the people who have already solved the problem that you're also looking to solve. Okay, so there's this idea here for like in the early stages, you're naturally just going to have basically talent debt, and every company goes through that. The next thing you're also going to have, and this is actually something which is interesting, which Lemlist actually had to go through themselves as well. I know I'm referencing Lemlist here quite a few times because we're releasing a case study breakdown on them shortly, but like they went through very similar a technical debt in terms of like, okay, they scaled very quickly and they had a lot of scale, but like unfortunately their backend, their infrastructure wasn't actually set up correctly the best possible way. So they actually had to slow down for a while and actually solve a lot of their technical debt. And that was during this stage here. And it did slow them down for quite a while, but like, it's just a stage which most companies, especially SaaS companies, just have to go through. And, you know, that can be called technical debt in SaaS for like infrastructure, but it can also be process debt in terms of like how teams are operating internally, because here, you know, to go from 20 to 30 million, it's a bigger growth milestone, and you need to be able to, you know, bolt on like parts little by little. Okay, so this is a key part here. And then after, I'd say like, you know, bringing in different processes. Maybe that's also like having the sales team maybe come in and, depending on the size of the sales team, are trying to build out that element for like, you know, the sales team can identify different users and different companies already using the product, which they can potentially upsell once they actually see like great activation. For example, Airtable did this pretty well. They saw, you know, free users which were well integrated into the product and saying like, okay, here it's a good company, good fit. It's an opportunity for an upsell, and like having basically the sales team, you know, scout out opportunities like this. You know, these are key parts also going to help you basically increase the ACV and basically get from, you know, one part to the next part. Okay, so there's this idea here of like different changes internally in terms of structure, but also the idea of basically scaling out the acquisition into more channels and diversification. And it's actually interesting to come back to Lemlist again one more time, but like they added actually like 1.8 million ARR in 2024 thanks to SEO. And they only picked up the channel actually just like, well, what is it, 4 or 5 years into the company. That's only the first time they've actually considered scaling it out as far as they did. But like they could have definitely done that sooner, but it just shows, but like it's during this stage here where you're really trying to maximize basically a lot of all the channels which you want to be thinking about. And it just shows that like during this stage here, you really want to double down on a few channels and the ones which you put the most conviction in. But still, it just shows like they could have doubled down to SEO sooner, but they didn't. But still, it doesn't mean like that was the wrong path to do. It just means that like, hey, you can open up more channels basically during this stage here. Okay, so that's between the 10 to 30 million ARR. Let's study the next one. So for this fourth stage, we're going to be covering from 30 mil to 100 mil and what that growth journey actually looks like. So here, often there's some really big changes that are going to happen. First of all, there's going to be often a shift in terms of the markets actually served from the SaaS company. So, for example, Lemlist are going through this shift right now where they're growing at the 30 million ARR stage and trying to basically increase from there. And they're actually moving towards localizing their products in different languages. So going after the German market, going after the French market, which are also huge markets. In Germany, it's about 90 million people. In France, it's about 70 million people. So big markets as well. And I think that today Germany actually represents 25% of new ARR for Lemlist basically every single year. So this is one of the key strategies in terms of like going often, and a key pattern from going from like this stage relatively of growth to like this next milestone here is trying to basically bolt on new markets and trying to basically localize a product for those markets. Canva would be another example that also did this. The next part as well, which is often a key pattern, is trying to bolt on new products which are adjacent basically to the current use case. That way it can be upsell paths in terms of increasing, once again, the LTV of a single user and company based on how much they pay you. So a very clear example of this was HubSpot, for example. HubSpot started expanding into multiple areas such as sales, marketing, customer service, etc. All these different parts which basically could bolt on new features and upsell paths for customers. That's what HubSpot started adding onto their product, which means they could basically maximize the LTV they could get out of a single user. Okay, so that's also a key trait often which we see of like companies trying to grow from this stage to this stage. And it's also the idea usually as well of trying to basically build like a brand moat and like a narrative inside the market. I would say, for example, like Webflow, they owned very well the whole no-code narrative of like website building, and that was like a key thing which made that like they had a very strong footprint inside that specific category and just made them like a market leader basically. Okay, so that's the key idea. And I'd say the last thing in terms of team size, like here, once again, it just shows you like once again like what got you here won't get you there, but like it's often another milestone where teams often go for like a different setup in terms of like who is actually leading the different teams, because like if you start to have like global teams, in that case like once again the setup changes, and once again like leadership has to evolve, etc. So once again you go for like a new stage of growth in terms of like how the setup actually works internally in terms of team. Okay, so lots of changing parts inside this stage here, which are just once again just new problems to be solved basically. So this stage is going to be the stage from 100 million to a billion ARR, okay? So obviously this is a stage not a lot of companies actually get to. And we're just going to use some real life examples of companies that like been inside these stages and what have they done actually differently. So first idea which comes to mind is the idea of moving away from a standalone SaaS to actually a platform where other companies can also build on top of yours and build their business on, okay? So one example comes to mind is Shopify. There's lots of other SaaS companies which build partner apps on top of the Shopify ecosystem and they build their business on it. And that means that like your space inside the market is just extremely clear, and like you basically own, if not the monopoly, but like you own such a big control basically of that market because so many other people rely on you basically, and you are clearly the leader basically. So there's that idea here of like moving away from like a SaaS standalone to actually like a platform. And next idea as well, I would say, is the idea of like maybe owning a specific narrative inside the category which you're in. So for example, Snowflake, they own the whole idea of like the mental model of like data cloud compared to simple the data warehouse. It's like that was one way of owning a very specific take and basically taking a very clear positioning inside that market and owning a new way of doing things. Okay, that's one idea. And next idea as well, I'd say in terms of like patterns of how companies operate, is that now they have all this financial leverage. Often they start to move towards merger and acquisitions in terms of basically speeding up the process, whether that be basically bolting on smaller companies and taking their customer bases into their bigger customer base, or also even from a question of like owning up more attention inside the marketplace. So SEMrush, for example, in the SEO software space, they basically bought Search Engine Land recently. So a website which obviously also owned a lot of the attention of the SEO community. They bought up their assets. Once again, they get that attention. They also bought up Backlinko, another website owned by Brian Dean. So once again, buying up attention. And they also bought like Traffic Think Tank, so an SEO community. So here there's this mindset, but like they're inside the I think 400 million ARR mark, SEMrush, but like they're basically using their financial leverage to go and basically buy attention and just basically speed up the whole process of owning all that attention inside the marketplace. So that's their idea there. And there's also, for example, HubSpot, who bought up the Hustle for 20 million plus. So once again, another acquisition merger strategy. So that's a wrap basically in terms of like all these growth stages, in terms of like other companies and what they've done at different stages. As you can see, like there is very different processes and like actions required at each stage of growing a SaaS company, and it's very different from one stage to the other. And it just comes back to this idea: what got you here won't get you there, because every single time the problems which you're going to face are going to evolve, and it's not going to be the same levers you're actually going to have to pull on to actually grow to the next stage, which means like you have to basically think about things differently, and that involves lots of changes both internally in terms of what you're doing, in terms of also who you're doing it with, basically on a team. So that's a wrap there in terms of like all the stages to grow, like in the beginner stages all the way to other companies, like how they've actually seen basically their growth. So one of the ideas which we talked about in one of these stages was the idea being that during the 1 to 10 million ARR stage, you're having a very narrow focus on your marketing channels, but still you're starting to basically expand which acquisition channels you're actually focusing on. So I've created a separate video on the best SaaS marketing channels which you should be focusing on this year and beyond, and the ones which actually deserve your attention and your focus. So if you're interested in that topic, feel free to check out the other video on the side.